Without further ado, I'd like to introduce James Kelly. And James is an architect who, from the same colleges I studied in DIT from 1988. He worked in the UK before returning home in 1993, where he set up his own practice, which was later joined by Dennis Cogan in 98. Special interest is in the area of conservation, housing and urban design. And he's chairman of the Dublin Civic Trust, who are behind the special conference here today. So without further ado, I'd like to ask James to come forward and talk about Dublin's forgotten pleasure grounds.
I'm here to talk about a slightly different subject. I mean, we're talking about squares and gardens and places like that. I'm talking about pleasure grounds, and as a result, I think I might be the light entertainment in the middle of the day. So no difficult questions about dodecahedrons or platonic solids. Here we have an extract from Mahony of 1856 showing Rutland Square as it then was, and in it you can see that by and large the fabric of the square is intact. It's easy to misunderstand Dublin squares. They differ in age by as much as 100 years, and in many cases they've changed beyond all recognition. Parnell or Rutland Square is a pleasure garden, and it's built to contain public entertainment. So even in its current state, it's a rare surviving urban space of international significance, and that's an important point. We'll talk about the origins of the pleasure gardens briefly. In the medieval city, hangings, bull baiting, and for the well-to-do bowling were the pastimes of choice. Bring the kids to see the hanging or the burning, and you had a lovely day out for all the family. The 16th and 17th century precursor of the pleasure garden was the bowling green. It was walled and it had its entry restricted to subscribers. Now, they were places of privilege. They were the equivalent of today's golf and country clubs in their impact upon the desirability of a neighbourhood. Here we have two in Marlborough Street, Dawson Street. At the bottom is Smithfield, which is enclosed with walls built by, I think, William Robinson, actually. So they were places of privilege. It's no coincidence that successful 17th century developments, such as Smithfield and St Stephen's Green, were each equipped or in the neighbourhood of suitably exclusive bowling greens. Smithfield, for example, which was laid out in 1665, was one of the first successful planned suburbs, and it set the scene for much of what was to follow. It was really the first Renaissance square. The laying out of the bowling green contributed to that success. The Smithfield Bowling Green was described in 1699 by John Dunton as perhaps the finest in Europe and the only thing that Dublin has to equal or exceed London. It remained a prominent feature of the city, but it was redeveloped in the 1730s, and that actually really started the death knell for the area as a high-status neighbourhood. In the 17th century, new urban forms on the French model emerged, as discussed by Todd. They comprised planted squares laid out for the benefit of the middle classes. In London, it happened with Leicester Fields, Golden Square and Soho Square, and in Dublin with St Stephen's Green and Merrion Square. Now, access to those squares remained restricted to residents and key holders. Nonetheless, they represent a watershed in civic planning in the period. And this is Stephen's Green, railed and fenced and all decked out for fireworks display for the victory of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1740, was it? Now, where it gets interesting is with the emergence of the pleasure gardens. The pleasure garden concept, it dates from Roman times, but in these islands it was revived in the late 17th century with the development of the first tea or pleasure gardens, and it spread rapidly throughout continental Europe and the Americas. Now, for an entry fee, the public could escape from the streets. They could gain access to these squares for an evening of entertainment, socialising and romance. They could enjoy manicured grounds, fountain displays, light refreshments, classical concerts, acrobatics and fireworks. The newly fashionable zigzag Chinese walks were ideal places for romantic trysts. You couldn't be seen. And for those whose tastes ran in that direction, for prostitution. For example, Cooper's Gardens, a much smaller square on the south bank of London, was closed down within a relatively short period after being opened up because of the low morals of its participants. And by the way, that was known apocryphally as Cupid's Gardens, Cupid's measles being the pockmarks that were formed by syphilis. Vauxhall Gardens, which you see here, was developed on the south bank of the Thames in 1661 as New Spring Gardens, and it comprised a single layout of planted walks hedged with fruit and vegetables. It was remodelled in 1732 by Jonathan Tyers, the proprietor, as the Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens, and remained successful and predominant for the next 100 years. Following the opening gala, at which guests including the Prince of Wales paid the huge sum of £1 guinea to attend, the entrance fee was dropped to £1. In addition to the cost of the ticket, the visitors paid for the refreshments, but all of the entertainments were provided for free. Music was a major attraction. In 1769, 12,000 people saw Handel rehearsing his fireworks music at the gardens. Open-air dining was also a highlight, and Vauxhall featured 50 or so supper boxes where you had a private alcove decorated with artworks where parties could enjoy cold meat, salad, cheese, custards, tarts and strong punch. Now, this is a slightly muzzy little print because I've tried to blow it up, but it's a very important one. This is the New York Vauxhall Gardens. Other countries, other cities were quick to see the potential, and pleasure gardens opened around the world, particularly in the Americas and even later in places like Australia. Many of them were called Vauxhall after the original. This is the New York Vauxhall Gardens, located between the Bowery and Broadway, and you can see it's really just somebody's private little garden with a shed to charge admission. But it's charming. Here we have Ranelagh. The Ranelagh Gardens opened in London in 1742 on the site of today's Chelsea Flower Show grounds. It cost £16,000 to develop, and it charged a much higher entry fee than Vauxhall. The site of the gardens was Ranelagh House, which had been built in 1688 beside Chelsea Hospital. In 1741, the house and the grounds were bought by a syndicate comprising the proprietor of the Theatre of Drury Lane and a number of his cronies, and the gardens opened to the public in the following year. Ranelagh was more fashionable than the Vauxhall Gardens. The entrance charge was 2 shillings and sixpence compared to a shilling at Vauxhall. Walpole wrote soon after the gardens opened, and I'm not entirely sure that he meant this in a complimentary sense, "It has totally beat Vauxhall. You can't set your foot without treading on a prince or a duke of Cumberland." The centrepiece at Ranelagh was a gigantic rococo rotunda with a diameter of 120 feet, which was designed by William Jones, a surveyor to the East India Company. The central support housed a chimney and fireplaces for use in winter. It was an important venue for musical concerts again. In 1765, 9-year-old Mozart performed there. Canaletto painted the gardens, and he painted the interior of the rotunda twice. A Chinese pavilion was added in 1750, along with an ornamental lake and several walks. The rotunda was closed in 1803, and it was demolished 2 years later. Now, these features are important because this is where we're beginning to see the emergence of a language: the rotunda, the Chinese walks, the little garden buildings, the pavilions. Ranelagh was a popular venue. Edward Gibbons wrote that it was the most convenient place for courtships of every kind, and I'm sure that they weren't the kind of courtships that existed in Cupid's Gardens. The best market we have in England, so maybe they were. A Ranelagh Gardens was opened in New York in the 1770s as in the former Rutgers House as a rival to the now famous New York Vauxhall Gardens. It's long vanished, and for many years it's been a football ground. The site is now part of the grounds of Chelsea Hospital and is the venue of the annual Chelsea Flower Show. Which brings us to our pet here, which is Parnell Square. And this dreadful aerial view, I'm sure you can begin to make some of it out. It shows, sorry, can you hear me? This is the hospital, the forecourt, this awful range of buildings here to the west. The Gardens of Remembrance and the Cloister buildings. Now, Parnell Square or Rutland Square was unusual even by the standards of the 18th century. Unlike its English contemporaries, which were usually laid out on lands which were peripheral or suburban to the city. It's urban in character. It's located within the heart of the city. It's centred also between two great palace structures. That's Palace Row to the north and the hospital to the south. The other interesting thing is it has a building on it. It actually accommodates a single building, which is very unusual with these things. To the south, it's bordered by Richard Castle's Lying In Hospital, and to the north by Palace Row. Now, it's also unusual in that it has 3 sides rather than 4, and it's axially planned from the front entrance hall of the Lying In Hospital through to the central doorcase of Charlemont House in the north, which is all the way through there, if you can see that line. The 4th side is enclosed by the Rotunda Hospital and assembly rooms to the south. It contains all of the elements, and they're all still there, all of the elements of the 18th century pleasure gardens: the gardens, the assembly rooms, the terraces, the monumental obelisks, and the rotunda. Now, in a prelude to the history of the square, it's worth looking at how it came about. The development of the Lying In Hospital and pleasure gardens were linked. In 1745, Bartholomew Moss, a medical doctor, opened a public maternity hospital in George's Lane, Fade Street in Dublin, which was the first such hospital in the British Isles and later copied as a model. Moss was born in Queen's County in Portlaoise in 1712, and he'd been a military man, and he had travelled widely in Europe before he decided to study medicine. He was highly cultured, he had a genuine and passionate interest in the condition and the interests of the poor, and he was a great friend to many artists, architects, master craftsmen, and builders. He was also a gifted fundraiser, and he recognised early on the potential of entertainment in raising significant revenue. The hospital in George's Lane was successful and outgrew its premises by 1748. So Moss decided to have a new hospital purpose-built, and in 1748, with £500, he leased a large plot of land north of Drogheda or Sackville Street. These lands had accommodated a bowling green, barley fields, some small thatched houses, and a noddy or a cab stand. The square or the new gardens were designed by Robert Stevenson, another Stevenson, in 1749, and they were actually developed before the lying-in hospital. They financed the construction of the hospital. So the new gardens were completed relatively quickly, and by 1751, which was the date of the laying down of the foundation stones for the hospital, they contributed £4,000 towards the cost of the new hospital, from plays, performances, oratorios, etc. Now, this is a 1764 image, but it's rather nice because it gives you quite a lot of detail. The first development on site was the new gardens, not the hospital. It's an important point to remember because the pleasure gardens, again, they provided the finance for the hospital. This is a case of gardens and pleasure gardens actually financing themselves, and not just themselves, but something else. It was a good site, it was well drained, it was warm and sunny, and it sloped. It has a very, very strong slope down to the south. And long before the hospital opened in 1759, the gardens were a social and a financial success. Now, I'm going to try and avoid talking too much about the surrounding streets because I'm primarily interested in the gardens, but I don't think I can avoid it. The success of the gardens resulted in the development of the surrounding streets. The hospital itself was completed by 1759. The east side of the square, Cavendish Street, was set out by Luke Gardner from 1753. The west side of the square, Granby Row, was set out by Luke Gardner's sons from 1758. The north side of the square was set out by John Enser from 1760. The ground of Palace Row to the north belonged to Moss, and the plots were leased to Enser by Moss's widow and sons when he died in 1759. So it's a fashionable place. The pleasure gardens were initially organised in a formal manner. They were surrounded by a low wall inside of which were 2 rows of elm trees. Moss built a pavilion on the east side, the assembly rooms, and he ornamented the gardens with statuary by Van Nost. Within a relatively short period, those layouts had developed further. North of the hospital, up a steep bank, was a terrace, followed by a large open space on the site of the old bowling green. This was the location of the public spectacles, like the firework displays and masks. The open green was surrounded by serpentine walls and planting on its east end, and it had an amphitheatre or an exedra, half surrounded by a wilderness of little walks in the Chinese fashion. It was partly enclosed on its other side by double lines of elm trees again. Finally, in front of what's now Charlemont House, on its northern boundary was an orchestra area. And that was designed and implemented by the sculptor Simon Verpeel and by John Egan. The assembly rooms to the southeast were built after Moss's death, and they completed the composition. Now, this is an interesting little thing. It's a drawing of the Fountain of the Goddess Tiburtina, done by Sir William Chambers on his tours around Italy. And I find it interesting because the orchestra seems to have been designed to complement the appearance of Palace Row from the gardens in rather the same way that the arcades on the bottom of the Mall concentrate the eye towards the houses above in London. So I think the orchestra was designed to complement the appearance of Palace Row from the gardens, and that this particular arrangement may have originated with Chambers, who illustrated similar arcaded revetments in Tivoli in his Grand Tour sketchbooks. Small structures designed to look like temples were scattered around the gardens and served refreshments or provided shelter, along with grottos and bridges and all the usual things. Now, the residents of the square could make use of the gardens, and they paid 11 shillings and 4 pence per year for the key on a yearly subscription. Other users paid either a yearly subscription or an entrance fee. Now, this illustration by Thomas Rowlandson suggests that gaining admission might be sometimes stressful. You can see there that somebody's trying to blag their way in the front door, but they're having trouble getting past the jugglers. Let's talk a little bit about the landscape and the language of that landscape. Much of the landscape and structure was designed in the Chinese taste. That was fashionable at the time. The pattern and layout of the gardens is extremely important. They were meant to be seen from the upper floors of the surrounding houses, and they were complemented by views to the Dublin mountains. The basic layout of the gardens is still recognisable and it's partly intact. Now, despite all of the tarmac and the car parking, the nurses' home, the loss of the front lawn, and the other modern hospital structures scattered throughout, quite a bit of the terrace structure remains. Those of you who walked in will have been walking up and down slopes. And quite a large number actually, of the original stone obelisks and fragments of retaining wall structures and fragments of lamp standards remain. You can see them if you walk around here. A lot of them are lying on their sides. They're in a semi-ruinous state. This is the Garden of Epicurus. A Chinese or Sharawaji garden was sited on the northeast end of the new gardens, and it was carefully set out to replicate the controlled wilderness made fashionable by Sir William Temple in the 1660s and Horace Walpole 100 years later. These gardens were characterised by asymmetrical layouts in the pattern of walkways and the placing of trees and planting. They had sinuous paths dotted by clearings or round spaces and featuring ornamental objects and statuary. There were pagodas, pavilions to mark the different stages of the journey. In England and Ireland, they were very much associated with performance and acted as a social stage. They were the scene of musical performances and firework displays and balloon ascents with animal shows, concerts, balls and masks, sometimes all happening at the same time. Here we have an advertisement from the Freeman's Journal, and it's just worth checking through the list of things that you could see. You had the overtures, Act 1, Act 2, you had violin concertos, people singing, and then the gardens would be illuminated, and between the second and third act of the concert will be exhibited a view of Mount Vesuvius, defended by Mr. Kelly, the fireworks by Monsieur Gay, and the painting by Mr. Jolly. And subscribers were not admitted. That was a private function. Here we have a bill advertising the benefits to subscribers, and cast your eye over that as I'm rambling. And we have some 18th century designs for illuminations and fireworks on the right in public gardens. I should add that terracing was an important feature, and it would be worth investigating whether the terraces accommodated water features as was common in France and Italy. The pavilions on Palace Row served as rest houses for the sedan chair carriers, and they were designed in the style of Tuscan temples. They were removed in 1942. I'm not going to talk at length about the hospital because I'm running short on time now, Karen, am I? 5 minutes. But I'll just lash through and show some of the prints. Here's the hospital as built in 1759 with the two arcades to either side, built to accommodate statues of George II and his son, the Prince of Wales. The rules of the hospital, which anybody who wants to attend the walk tomorrow can hear. And the plan of the hospital as presented to the Lord Lieutenant in 1788 in its complete form. Plasterwork in the chapel and the actual appearance. Now, the appearance wasn't static. You can see the ends of the arcades here if you look to either side of the hospital, and you can also see the unrendered image of the rotunda itself. As I said, I won't talk about the houses, but I'll just flash through some of the detail. Very fine plasterwork, very fine joinery, and extremely good carving. The quality of the architecture on Palace Row is particularly interesting. And the development of the north side of the square followed a slightly different pattern to that of the west and the east sides. It's very cohesive, it's stylised, and it's axial. According to Anthony Duggan, it's believed that Ensor master-planned the north side of the square as early as 1755. Lord Charlemont acquired the double site at the centre of the row in 1762 to build his townhouse there. The elevation which Palace Row presents is one of the finest compositions of 18th century architecture in the city. It's very, very skillfully handled, with a degree of confidence and integrity not encountered elsewhere in Dublin. Here we have the gable elevation of 28 Rutland Square and the plan. The handling of that gable is particularly interesting. It begs the question as to whether a matching gable was located on the eastern end of Palace Row facing onto Denmark Street. Now, it's been suggested that there are similarities between this house and one in Grosvenor Square in London. That remains to be investigated. The overall relationship of Palace Row with the new gardens and ultimately with the garden facade of the lying-in hospital is unified. It's very, very unified. The alignment of the entrance doorway with Charlemont's house is no accident. The common cornices and rustication, where Charlemont House joins with those houses, and their grand character suggest a common plan and perhaps a common design genesis with Charlemont House. And the name Palace Row is indicative of a common character and purpose. With the single exception of the earlier and more crudely aligned opposing terraces of Henrietta Street, it's the only example of a palace elevation in Dublin. And here we have James Caulfield, the Earl of Charlemont, and his house. Here we have views to the Rockingham Library and the Venus Library. Now, let's talk about the current use of the gardens and where they stand. I think Des McCabe mentioned earlier on the categories of buildings and of squares that we have in Europe. I'm going to give him a new one. I'm going to give him the Garden Square as a traffic hub. The square today presents a sad sight. While there have been some positive developments in relation to the conservation of single houses, and in particular the plans of Dublin City Council for Palace Row, the Garden Square, which generated the surrounding streetscape, Granbury Row, Palace Row, the Rotunda, the Assembly Rooms and the Lying-in Hospital, is totally neglected and imperilled. Poor management of traffic has turned some of the most elegant Georgian terraces in Europe into bus parks, while the very future of the Garden Square itself is under threat. This arises from a failure to recognise the significance and importance of the square. I can think of no other instance where the notion of building a new development on an 18th century square would be tolerated by the authorities, but that's just what we have going on here. Plans were announced in 2005 for the development of the square, you can see them on the left here, by the Rotunda Hospital, comprising an extensive development of the perimeter of the square as further accommodation for the hospital. Tellingly, the authors of that plan correctly described the square as Dublin's lost Georgian Square, at the end of the great axis running from St Stephen's Green through the rejuvenated O'Connell Street northwards. The square has the potential to be the jewel in the north side of Dublin City, and then went on to design a building all over it. However, despite that understanding, they proposed that the Rotunda Hospital builds a new development over a large part of the square, comprising a new four-storey buildings facing on the Parnell Square, east and west, with increased car parking facilities. The ground floor is to have appropriate commercial and public uses. It appears also that, notwithstanding the excellent recent work by Dublin City Council to upgrade Daithí Hanley's Gardens of Remembrance and to realign them on the centre of Charlemont House, that further plans are now in train to squeeze in an ill-considered and totally inappropriate monument to victims of clerical abuse, the form and design of which will further erode the square and destroy its meaning and significance. And you see this thing on the right. Now, I'm going to make a modest proposal, and it doesn't involve eating babies. These two maps show, this is just interesting, they show the pleasure gardens in England and Ireland at the tail end of the 18th century on your left, and what remains at present. If you look at this, you'll realise that the only thing that remains in these islands in a near state of intactness, or in a state where its surroundings, its environment, its context survive, is Dublin, is Parnell Square. Parnell Square is not of national significance, it's of international significance. Parnell Square is a rare survivor of all of the pleasure gardens developed in 18th century England, Ireland, continental Europe and the United States. It's the only survivor, and it retains that potential for restoration. Now, the surviving elements. In the grounds, we have the obelisks, we have the fragmentary terracing, and we have the original structures. The square needs to be reconsidered with a view to the long-term removal of bus parking on its surrounding streets and also the modern above-ground hospital structures, with the aim of reinstating the gardens in their original form. The viability of a full-scale maternity hospital on this site is questionable. It doesn't mean the hospital doesn't have a role in the future and the life of the square, nor that it should be excluded from the square. But it may best be served, the hospital may best be served, by the provision of new attendant facilities on an outlying site. With the regeneration of Palace Row and the former Coláiste Mhuire buildings, there is an opportunity for the square to be brought back into the life of the city. An approach along those lines would see the square return to its original significance in the city and act as a catalyst for the regeneration of this particularly beautiful but sorely neglected part of the north inner city. It would also be a development of international cultural significance which would pay dividends in the long run. Dublin's a city built on legacies. We're all aware of the negative legacies of the Celtic Tiger, when short-term thinking, poor planning and the pursuit of profit at all costs impoverished our country, not only financially but culturally. We forget too easily the genuine utopian legacies of citizens such as Bartholomew Moss, James Caulfield, Richard Castles, who didn't charge for his work, John Ensor and many others. It's clear from Dublin City Council's approach to Palace Road that a genuine attempt is being made to address this imbalance. The restoration and full reinstatement of Parnell or Rutland Square New Gardens would be to the benefit of the nation and would cement the success of these proposals. Thank you very much.